Encourage you to get a Bible and let's turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and in verse 16. And here the Apostle Paul writes his second letter to the Thessalonians saying, Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace always in every way. The Lord be with you all. I want us to look at this phrase, peace always in every way. It's a unique phrase. Peace always in every way. Let's define some of our terms. He first mentions, and this seems to be a prayer and a request that I want for you, my plea for you is that you might have peace always in every way. What does it mean by peace? Well, Ellicott says it means the deep tranquility of a soul resting wholly upon God. That's interesting. I might ask, do you feel that your soul is resting wholly upon God? That is, you have this inner tranquility. It has reference to that inner tranquility of the heart, that is, of the mind and conscience. And so Paul's prayer was, or his plea was, that they may have peace, that inner tranquility of their mind that rests solely upon God. Then he says, always. This is a peace that does not change with outward circumstance. This is not a peace that comes on a series of occasions, but a peace that is unchanged. In other words, this is not a peace that you have it today, but then next week I just don't have peace anymore. I just got problems in my life and I don't have this peace now. I hope I can get it back someday. And then it comes back and then it leaves again and then it comes back. This is a peace that is always a continual peace. It is not affected by the outward circumstance. And then he says, in every way. Peace always in every way. That is, in every kind of situation, in every place, and at all times. If I'm in this circumstance, I have that peace. If I'm in that circumstance, if I'm in this place or in that place, or if it's in this period of my life or in that period of my life. Always. In every place. In every way. By every means. Whatever is going on in my life, I have this peace. This tranquility. Linsky said this on that phrase. He said, it is the condition that obtains when all is well between God and us. Now I'll finish that quotation. Get that picture. This is the frame of mind. This is the condition of the mind. When all is well between you and your God, you have peace. And from this flows the subjective feeling of peace in our hearts, which, though it sinks at times, always arises anew out of the objective condition, since this remains unchanged. I like what Linsky says there. This is based on this relationship we have with God, this peace that we have because of our relationship with God being right, that is unchanged. It may sink at times, but it always arises anew. I like what he says. But that's not all that our text says. Our text goes on to say, peace always in every way, the Lord be with you all. That's interesting. Again, Linsky says this, the Lord's peace is where the Lord himself is. Get that concept. The Lord's peace is where the Lord himself is. Thus the brief wish, the Lord be with you all, completes what we may call the prayer. I want you to have peace always in every way. And to complete the thought, the Lord of peace be with you. That's when indeed you have peace. So let me ask you this. Are you at peace always in every way? And so when we saw that phrase a little earlier, when we first introduced that, if you weren't familiar with that from 2 Thessalonians 3, did you immediately think of your own life and say, that describes me. I have peace always in every way. Would you describe that in your life? Is your peace an occasional peace? That I can remember a time when I was at peace, but I don't remember how long it's been, but there was a time where I was. Is that describing you? Is your peace the kind of thing that your life is frustrating and your life is just full of anxiety? And my life is just topsy-turvy all the time. Is that your description of your life? Or would you say my life is described by that text, peace always in every way? Is there always a problem in your life? You're constantly upset. Oh, there's constantly something in turmoil in your life. Are you down more than you're up? Do you ride the roller coaster where I'm down and then I hit the roller coaster and man, things are just great and then they go down again and then great and then they're down and I'm just on this roller coaster all the time? Does that describe you? And if that describes us, it may be that we're lacking the peace that this text is describing, because this text says there can be peace always in every way. Now, every child of God should not only desire peace. You say, this sounds great. I would love to have that peace. What you're describing sounds like a dream. I would love to have peace always in every way. That should not only be our desire, but we should have that real peace. You say, well, why do you say that? You see, our Father is described as the God of peace in Romans 15. And our Lord is said to be the Lord of peace. Our Savior is the Prince of Peace. And the gospel that the Spirit revealed is the gospel of peace. And do you realize peace is mentioned in every book of the New Testament with the exception of 1 John? You just open your Bible to any book of the New Testament except 1 John, and there's something about peace in that. It must be an important concept, and it must be something attainable. I can't imagine most of the New Testament mentioning peace, but it's not attainable. You can't have it. It's out of your reach. You want it, but you just can't touch it. We can have peace always in every way. So let's raise the question, what is peace? You say, this sounds great. I'd love to have it. I wished I could reach out and get it. I wished I knew where to buy it. I wished I could buy a box. I wished I could buy a pallet of that. I wished we could have some peace. What is peace? Thayer says that word peace means according to a conception distinctly peculiar to Christianity. In other words, here's a quality that's peculiar to Christianity. All right, what is that, Thayer? Remember, he's a lexicographer. He's defining. He said, is a tranquil state of a soul assured of its salvation through Christ. He says this peace is this assurance, it's unique to Christianity, assurance that comes because we know that we have salvation through Christ, and so fearing nothing from God and content with its earthly lot of whatsoever sort it is. Because I have this assurance before God, it doesn't matter about this, and doesn't matter about that, doesn't matter about this problem, doesn't matter if I have much or have little. I have peace despite the circumstance. Now let's give a few passages that deal with this peace. We're going to contrast some things. Let's go to Luke chapter 24. And I want to introduce a thought in Luke 24, and we're going to close later on by looking at Luke chapter 24. But Luke chapter 24 and verse 36 beginning. This is after Jesus' resurrection. He comes in the midst of the disciples. And we just want to read 3 verses. We'll look at the greater context a little bit later. But at this point, Jesus stood in the midst of the disciples and he said, peace to you. That's our concept. But they were terrified and frightened and supposed they'd seen a spirit. And he said to them, why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Do you see a contrast? Get that contrast. But he said, peace be to you. But they were afraid and they were terrified and there were doubts. You see the contrast? You will in a moment if you don't already. Let's go to John 14 now. Introduce another passage. John 14 and in verse 27. Jesus said, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, nor let it be afraid. Peace, don't be troubled or be afraid. You see the contrast? Seeing a contrast? You will in a moment. Let's go to chapter 16 now. Let's get one more passage and we'll see the contrast. Go to John 16 and in verse 33. These things I've spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. There's our concept. In the world you will have tribulation. Be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. Here's what I want you to see. These passages all say, Jesus is saying, peace be to you. I want you to have peace. I'm pronouncing peace. I'm giving you peace. I'm offering you peace. But the contrast was being terrified and frightened, being troubled, having doubts, being afraid, and having tribulation. So does your life, could it be described as my life is just full of tribulation? My life is full of trouble and doubts. I'm afraid, I'm frightened, I'm terrified. That's just my life. That's the way I live. Then I don't have the peace. But peace is put in contrast and opposed to those concepts we see there, and we'll see that more later on. So let's talk about peace always in every way. That's our phrase from 2 Thessalonians 3:16. I want to look at 4 things about how peace comes. How do you get this peace? And so if your appetite has been whetted just a little bit, you say, boy, I like the concept of having this peace. I don't know that I've got it, but I would love to have it. How do you get that peace? Let's talk about 4 ways in which that's accomplished. Here's the first. Peace comes through forgiveness. Peace comes through forgiveness. And the reason for that is that those in sin are not at peace. So let's go to the book of Romans. As you're turning to Romans chapter 3, this is a context where the Gentiles are pictured as being in sin, chapter 1. Chapter 2, the Jews, chapter 3 pulls it all together. So I want you to notice in Romans chapter 3 and in verse 17, the text speaking of the Gentiles, the way of peace they have not known. The way of peace they don't know. Those in sin have not known peace. In fact, Romans 8 and verse 7 says that they are at enmity with God. We're enemies of God when we're in sin. So there's obviously not a peaceful relationship. Let's go to the 2nd chapter of the book of Romans, Romans chapter 2, and in verse 15, the guilt of conscience is troubling. When I come to recognize, you know what, I have sinned, I'm separated from God, I've violated the will of God, your conscience troubles you. Look at verse 15. And show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness. What's he talking about? That the Gentiles took the law of Moses, though they weren't under it, adapted some of the principles to their life, which convicted them, which means their conscience bothered them. And they therefore were not at peace. So I want to suggest to you that all peace begins with being right with God. When we are justified by faith, we have peace with God. Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God. So that's why we're saying peace comes through forgiveness. Listen, in Colossians chapter 1, we're reconciled through the blood of His Son, having made peace through the blood of His cross. See this being enmity with God, being separated from God, all that's brought back together through the blood of the cross. Forgiveness makes us right with God. Let's go to Acts chapter 10. In preaching the gospel to the first Gentile convert, in Acts 10 and verse 36, Peter preached that peace comes through Christ. The word which God sent to the children of Israel, preaching peace through Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all, not just of the Jews, but of the Gentiles as well. Peace comes through Christ. Now, what's removed when we are forgiven is the guilt of sin, not the fact or the consequences. In other words, here's a man guilty of stealing. Maybe he's been stealing from his company. And he gets arrested and he's put in jail and he seeks forgiveness and he obtains forgiveness from God. The fact that he was a thief is not removed. The consequences that he has to pay of no longer having a job, being now without money, spending time in jail, he still faces. But the guilt is what's removed. And so the text in Hebrews chapter 8 in verse 12 says that God remembers the sin no more. In other words, He takes the guilt and takes that away. The fact is still there. Consequence is still there. The guilt is removed. We need to be able to forgive ourselves, which means that we are no longer looking at our past. We're forgetting the things which are behind. Philippians chapter 3 would talk about that. That we forget what's behind and put that aside. Forgive ourselves. And so now we have peace. Notice in 1 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 21, you remember that it talks about how baptism is the answer of a good conscience. What does it mean, an answer? The idea of answer is an inquiry of. You're inquiring of God that I might have a clear conscience. My conscience bothers me because of my sin. So I'm baptized and I'm seeking of God that I might have a clear conscience. I'm asking for peace. I don't want that guilt feeling anymore. Peace comes through forgiveness. Now, when we are forgiven and we're right with God, nothing else matters. I want you to get that point. When I'm right with God and I'm in a right relationship with God, nothing else matters. Here's what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 9. It is our goal, whether present or absent, to be accepted of Him. He said, this is my goal. This is my purpose in life. This is what it's all about. What is it about, Paul? He said, my purpose in life is to be right with God, to be accepted of Him. Nothing else really matters. Nothing else really matters. The guilt is gone. The conscience is clear. That inner peace comes as an outgrowth of all of that. How do we gain this peace always in every way? First, through forgiveness. Secondly, peace comes through trust. We have that peace through trust that we put in our God and in His Word. Now, I want to suggest to you that anxiety and worry come as a lack of trust. By anxiety and worry, we're talking about some undue concern over matters that pertain to this life. God tells us, for example, we have to work. And we need to provide for our own and provide for our children, which means we have some concern. Am I going to have enough money to pay and take care of my kids and put them through school and put clothes on their back, put food on the table? And so we have some concern. But that undue concern, where our focal point is on this life, it comes because of a lack of trust. Let's go to Philippians chapter 4. We'll look at two passages that deal with that concept. Philippians chapter 4, beginning at verse 6. Matthew 6 will be the other we'll come to in just a moment. But Philippians 4 and verse 6 says, be anxious for nothing. Your translation may say, don't worry about anything whatsoever. You say, well, I thought we're talking about anxiety and worry. It's the same thing in this context. Don't worry about anything. Don't be filled with anxiety. So don't have this anxiety and worry that indicates a lack of trust. Now, how do I know it's a lack of trust? He said, but, here's your contrast. In everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made unto God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. What do I learn from that? I just learned from that context that a lack of trust is what's involved in this anxiety. Let's look at another passage, Matthew chapter 6. I'll say more about Philippians 4 in a moment. But we just recently came through Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And beginning in chapter 6, in verse 24 and 25 particularly, he starts this concept about worry, about anxiety and worry, which is a form of materialism. What will we eat? What shall we drink? And what shall we be clothed with? As if God's not going to provide for us. What are we going to do? Well, what I want you to see is at verse 30, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how will He not much more clothe you? And notice what Jesus said, O ye of little faith. Here's the point I want you to see. That is, this worry is in contrast to faith. Trust. Do you not trust your God to take care of you? That's His point. I want you to see this anxiety and robs us of our peace. Now go back to verse 6 and verse 7 of Philippians 4. I said we'd come back. Do not worry about anything whatsoever. Be anxious for nothing, depending on your translation. Now notice the contrast at verse 7. And the God of peace. Do you see that? In Philippians 4. If you've left there, go back to Philippians 4 and verse 7. He said, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through faith. In other words, peace is it put in contrast to this worry. If you're worried, you're being robbed of your peace. There's a contrast. We feel the weight of all of our concerns, and we're bearing the burden, and we're trying to figure out how we can do everything ourselves because we're so uncertain about the future. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know how it's going to turn out. We're not putting our trust where it needs to be. So let's go back to Philippians 4 and see that the answer is through prayer. That has to do with trust. Let's go back to Philippians 4 and verse 6. Be anxious for nothing. Don't be filled with fret. Don't be filled with anxiety. Don't be filled with worry. Here's a big word. You're going to miss it if you don't notice. Look at verse 6. But, contrast, in everything through prayer and supplication. Don't be anxious, but pray. Don't be filled with fret, but pray. Don't be filled with anxiety, but pray. And, verse 7, the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds through Christ. You want that peace? Put your trust and spend time praying to God. Take your needs to God and ask for His help. Now, what do we mean by needs? That which causes our anxiety. Whatever's causing my anxiety, it's got me all stirred up, got me all worried. Take those needs and take them to God. And pray to God about that. By needs, we're talking about that which robs us of our peace. You figure out what's going on in your life and you say, this, because that's on my mind, that's robbing me of the peace that I used to have. You take that to God. And notice Philippians chapter 4 says you do that with thanksgiving. It's interesting. Right in the middle of talking about fret and worry and things that bother us and got us all uptight. You take your needs to God and you notice that. Notice verse 6 again. He said, be anxious for nothing but in everything through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known unto God. In other words, be thankful for all the good, even in the midst of all that concerns us. I've got this problem but I still have a lot to be thankful for. If it's nothing other than this relationship I have with my God, I need to be thankful for that. Let's go to 1 Peter 5, verse 7. Cast your cares upon God. That word for cares is the same concept of worry and anxiety. All of these cares, the things that got me so uptight, the things got me all bothered, things got me all worried, the thing that's got my focal point on the here and the now, cast your cares upon Him because He cares for you. Leave it with Him and you trust Him. I don't know how to handle it. I don't know what to do, but God does know and He can handle it and I trust Him. And then we're not carrying the burden with us because we've cast our cares upon Him. Now, let's talk about an example of this kind of trust. Let's go to Philippians chapter 4. We were just at verse 6, 7, and 8. So in that same context of worrying, don't worry, but trust. We've just been talking about that context. In that context, Paul gives us an example. Notice, beginning at verse 10, he said, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, but now your last care for me has flourished again, though you do surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. He's talking about financial support that had been sent to him, that there was a time when it had waned and it was lacking, not because they didn't want to send it, but there was not the opportunity there. And so he said, I've had times when I've had support come. I've had times when it was not there. I've had times when I was doing without, and I've flourished at times. And I'm thankful you sent it to me. All right, what does that have to do with anything, Paul? But he said, I speak in regard to need. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I've learned in whatever state I am to be content. He said, I've learned the principle that when I had things, I did all right, and when I was without, I learned to manage that as well. Now notice at verse 12, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere, in all things, I've learned both to be full and to be hungry and to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What he's saying is, I've learned in this context of not worrying but putting my trust in God, to put my trust in God even when I had support and when I was without support and when I was hungry and when I was full. I've learned to live with all of that. Now I want to suggest to you, saying you trust God is not the same as putting your trust in God. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about peace coming through trust, saying, well, I trust God because I pray to God. There's a difference in that and truly putting your trust in Him. I cast my cares upon Him and I'm going to leave it there, and I can't do anything about that, so I'm going to leave that with God and I'm not going to worry about that anymore. There is indeed a big difference. Here's a third thing. Peace coming through understanding and assurance. You say, I sure would love to have this peace you've been talking about. This sounds exciting. I don't know that I've got it. I don't know if I've experienced that. And you can get that through forgiveness. You can get that through trust. But I also want to suggest to you can gain that peace through understanding and assurance. Now let's look at two passages which are parallel. By parallel, I mean they're talking about the same event, but different accounts. This is following the resurrection. Jesus makes an appearance to the disciples. Let's read the account, starting in John chapter 20. I want you to focus on some things here. I want you to see the fear, the misunderstanding, the peace that they are told about, and the peace they receive in contrast. Let's see if we can find that as we read the text. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, that's the very day he was raised from the dead, when the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled. Reckon why that was? For fear of the Jews. Doesn't sound like much peace, does it? Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." Then when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. So he said to them again, "Peace to you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you." That's a short reading. That's an interesting text. More about that in a moment. Let's go to the parallel account, Luke 24, beginning at verse 36. A few more verses here. Same account, same story, same event, in other words, a different account, I should say, of the same event. So beginning at verse 36. As they said these things, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were terrified and frightened and supposed they'd seen a spirit. Well, I suppose if you thought you'd seen a ghost, you'd be frightened too. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And doubts arise in your hearts. Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see me, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see me have." And when it said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. But while they did not believe for joy and marveled, he said to them, "You have any food here?" So they gave him a piece of broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took it and ate it in their presence. And he said to them, "These are the words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things would be fulfilled that are written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." And he opened their understanding that they might comprehend the Scriptures. Now, what does all that have to do with peace? Well, I want to suggest to you the disciples were filled with fear. Remember that? Now, go back just for a moment. Let's get the picture. Let's go back to John 20 if you've left that passage. Go back to John 20 where we just read it, verse 19. Jesus appeared in their midst, and the doors were shut. In other words, the doors were locked. They had secured the doors because they are fearful of the Jews. Perhaps you have vacation, go to a city that's known for crime, and you make sure the motel door is locked and secured, maybe put something against the door, and because you're just afraid of what may come. They're fearful. Luke 24 said they thought they'd seen a spirit. They were troubled. They were bothered. Doesn't sound like a picture of peace. So the doors were shut. They needed peace. And here's what Jesus said to them. He comes to them in the midst of all this fear that they had, and he says, "Peace to you." I don't want you to get the picture that it's just a thing. You just decide you're going to have peace. You just get it in your mind, you're going to have peace. That's not what he's saying. He's pronouncing peace, but he's going to tell them how you get peace. You don't just say, well, just decide you're going to have peace. That's not what he's saying. Look at John 20 and verse 20. The first thing he does is give them evidence of the resurrection. Look at John chapter 20 and verse 20. He showed them his hands and his side, and they were glad when they saw the Lord. It's me. It's me. I'm Jesus, the one that was crucified and died and was placed in the tomb. I'm back alive again. Proof. Look at my hands. Look at my side. Here's proof. He gave them evidence of the resurrection. Jesus has been raised from the dead. If that doesn't give you peace, nothing will. If you can look at all the evidence of the resurrection and you don't have peace in your heart, then something's missing. You've got to have peace when you consider the resurrection. But secondly, he gave them understanding of the Scriptures. Look at Luke chapter 24. Remember where he took the Scriptures then? This is in that same setting. And he said, do you remember how I talked to you about the law and the prophets and the Psalms was fulfilled in me? And he gave them the understanding of the Scriptures. He explained that these Scriptures are talking about me. And this is the fulfillment of that. Now let's put that all in context. Don't lose sight of the fact. He said, peace to you. And it wasn't a thing, hey, just figure it out and just think in your mind you're going to have peace. Now, let me give you the key to get it. Here's the evidence I was raised from the dead, and here's the understanding of the Scriptures. Now you have the key for peace. You've got the key for peace. They now have assurance. The result was, we just read, they were glad when they'd seen the Lord. See, that fear, the doors were shut and they're kind of trembling and shaking because of the fear of the Jews. They're glad. We got nothing to worry about now. Well, why don't you have anything to worry about? This is Jesus in our midst, and He was raised from the dead. We have nothing to worry about. The fear is gone. It's been turned into rejoicing. You see, we gain peace through our understanding and our assurance. The more we understand about God and His Word, the greater peace we have. We might have a sermon or a lesson or a class on evidences. And by the way, we're having a gospel meeting coming up in March on evidences, on evolution. And you may be one that says, I don't believe all that evolution stuff, so I really don't need that. I already believe God created the world. I don't need evidence of the resurrection. I already believe Jesus was raised from the dead. Do you realize every time you see another evidence and a reaffirmation of the resurrection of Christ, or an affirmation God created the world, that strengthens your faith, and that gives you greater peace. So I already believe I already believe in the resurrection, but when I see more evidence and stronger evidence and reaffirmation of evidence, that strengthens the peace that I have. See, they had peace when they saw Jesus had been raised from the dead. See, the more evidence we see that God is real and His Word is true, the more assurance we have. We have peace when I know God is on His throne and in control. When I know God rules in the kingdoms of men, and when I know that God hears my cry, and when I know what's really important. Here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. When we know that, we have genuine peace. Finally, peace comes through a spiritual mind. Peace through understanding. Peace through trust, peace through forgiveness, but peace through a spiritual mind. Peace is the result of a spiritual mind. Let's turn in our Bibles to Romans chapter 8 and in verse 6. The text says, for to be carnally minded, that's the opposite of a spiritual mind, is death. But to be spiritually minded is life and peace. You say, I don't want death, I want peace. I want life. That comes from a spiritual mind. It's essential to have peace with God. And then that inner tranquility comes as a result of that. That's what Romans 8 is about. So I've got to have the spiritual mindset to be right with God, and then as a result of being right with God, I have that inner tranquility that we've been talking about in all of these passages that mention peace. Now let's talk about the spiritual mind. The spiritual mind is opposed and opposite of the carnal mind. We saw that in Romans 8 and in verse 6. The carnal mind views life with self at the center. So you say, tell me what a carnal mind is. Well, show me somebody that their life is all centered around just doing whatever they want to do. Living their life like they want to live, pleasing themselves. That's the carnal mind. Focused on the here and the now. Now notice at verse 5, we're in Romans chapter 8, that we are to set our mind on spiritual things. That's the spiritual mind. We're trying to define the spiritual mind. Opposite of the carnal mind, it's a spiritual mind. Notice at verse 5. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. Now, let's stop there. We'll finish verse 5. Those that are carnally minded pretty much do whatever the mind or the body wants to do. What about the spiritual mind? But those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. In other words, the spiritual mind minds the things of the Spirit, the revelation of the Spirit. They heed the revelation of the Spirit. They're led and guided by the Spirit. Look at verse 14, same context. Look at verse 14. As many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. We won't take the time to trace that same concept in Galatians. The spiritual man, identified in 5 is the one that's led by the Spirit, the one who follows the teaching of the Spirit. Whatever the Spirit has said, whatever the Spirit reveals, he follows the teachings of the Spirit. Now let's talk about how the spiritual mind brings peace. We saw in Matthew chapter 6, the worry and the fretting and the anxiety is the focus on the here and the now and the material life. And that robs us of our peace. But Hebrews 13:14, we've already quoted, the spiritual mind focuses on all that really matters, being right with God. For here have we no continuing city. What does he mean? This is not where we live. This is not what life is all about. This is temporary, but we seek one ultimately to come. You see, the stronger our faith becomes, the stronger our peace is. When we don't have peace, our faith may not be as strong as we thought it was. And so the question is, do you have the peace always in every way? When we introduced that passage earlier, did you think, well, that's the peace I've got. That's talking about me? Or did you look at that and say, wow, I never heard of peace that's always in every way. I never heard of such. Then I may need to re-examine myself to see if I have that peace. How does that peace come? It comes through forgiveness. It comes through trust. It comes through understanding and assurance. It comes through a spiritual mind. Do you have that peace? If you're not a Christian, you're not a child of God. If you haven't done what the Lord has commanded of us to do that we might obtain the remission of sins, you do not have that peace with God. Would you come this morning believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?